All right, I hope you guys are ready for an action-packed video. We're gonna go over some of the ways I think the force-free community could bring more reinforcement-based dog training to the balance community, converting us to their side. I'm Sarah Prelle. I'm a balance trainer, but I have a few ideas about how the force-free community can up their game when it comes to educating us and promoting their reinforcement-based training. Let's start with the main arguments the R+ crowd cites for this being the superior method. Argument one is that science has a definitive answer, and therefore argument two, negative reinforcement and positive punishment are not necessary to accomplish the same result. Argument three is that it goes horribly wrong, whether that's because trainers lose their temper or they just have bad timing or they're just a little too harsh. It can go really wrong when used improperly. And argument four is that it's simply not ethical for us to compel or use compulsion when we're training dogs and maybe any species. We're going to go over all of these arguments in part 2 of this video series, so don't miss it. Be sure to watch the second video that comes right after. The goal of a lot of the force-free community is to completely remove all compulsion from training. Let's first talk about some of the methods the force-free movement uses to convince balance trainers, or maybe just the general public, that their side is indeed superior. Method number one, emotionally charged information. So much like another argument that's kind of going on in our political sector right now, the pro-life, pro-choice movement, sharing emotionally charged information quickly gets the attention of people and often villainizes somebody else. Photos like this are often shown, and even this, as a result of what training with a prong collar or tools can accomplish. This method can be super effective, especially when you're convincing the like-minded thinkers or want to have that rally cry for your cause, or to talk to people who are not yet decided. So showing pictures that really get people emotional and upset can really work. However, there's a huge problem with it, and the main one being it polarizes the entire dog training community. Okay, so even though I know I'm going to get a bunch of comments about comparing pro-life to dog training, I'm not comparing pro-life to dog training. I'm comparing the methods both parties use, the pro-life movement and the force-free movement, to convince people of their side. If the goal truly is to remove that compulsion, you would think that the overall argument or message would be really directed towards trainers still perpetuating the idea that we need tools. So when this method is used, it unfortunately alienates and also kind of loses your credibility, because a lot of the stuff that we see as balance trainers, let's say like myself, we see these pictures and we know they're not representative of what is happening. So to us, it's erroneous information, and therefore you kind of lose your credibility when trying to convince us of your argument. This is from the University of British Columbia, and it's pretty shocking. One of the pictures on here actually states a case of glaucoma. When choke collars are compressed around a dog's neck from the force of a lead, the blood pressure in the eyes increases, and this is the primary cause of glaucoma. When you read that, it actually sounds like the primary cause is choke chains, people using choke chains improperly. Yet if you actually research glaucoma all over the internet, all over WebMD or VetMD or whatever it is, you will never hear them citing choke chains as even part of the problem. Instead, it's vastly attributed to genetics. To a large portion of trainers, using words like torture and pain just do not represent what our training looks like. So you close down that channel of being able to communicate with somebody, and the people who are closest on the balance spectrum to the R+ cause are probably going to be the first ones to be alienated by this, because a lot of us have made huge sacrifices in our life. Over and over and over, our life is just a book of constant sacrifices we've made for dogs. So when we're learning something new from purely positive trainers and trying to make our training as reinforcement based as possible without losing any effectiveness, it means we may have to sit through an onslaught lot of attacks and villainization about how horrible we are. Now, nobody wants to hear that, especially people who have potentially, like myself, been homeless because of dogs, opted for not having housing before we took a dog back to the shelter that, let's say, we were fostering, compromised our world championship preparation by having stray puppies live with us, trucking puppies 3 hours to a veterinarian or to a rescue to get them care when we found them out in the middle of nowhere, bringing puppies across the border that we had found starving and fed while we were in Mexico, taking huge risks and having a lot of stress as a result of saving dogs. Was I actually homeless because of dogs? Yes, I was. There was a dog at the San Clemente Animal Shelter who was there for 2 years. She was adopted and returned 7 times. On her little intake notes, it would say things like ripped carpet to the floor of the car. She would freak out. She was a Beagle Chow mix, and sometimes the shelter would get there and open, and she would be on the roof. Her teeth were broken. She had scars all over her legs from escaping. And then the other problem she had was she bolted big time. She loved to hunt. Other than those 2 issues, that dog was the most perfect dog you would ever meet. Well, after doing a lot of volunteer work with her, of course, fixing her bolting problem systematically and formulaically, she was then allowed to be off the leash. She didn't have a bolting problem anymore, but she still had that ripping up problem. When I got to the point where I could no longer take her back at night to that shelter that she hated, I moved her in with me, and she probably did $2,000 to $3,000 worth of damage at that house. It was very unpredictable. I didn't really know what to do. I started having to take her everywhere with me, which of course I got villainized for that. You leave your dog in your car. I had no choice. She could escape any crate. We were asked to leave the house that she destroyed all the curtains, and we ended up homeless for a few months, and it was horrible. It was probably the worst experience of my life because of how shameful it was. I didn't tell my family. I didn't let my mom know. I lived in a campground, but every weekend it would be booked. So we would have to move to a different campground or stand in line for a lottery. The stuff was piled on top of my car. It was so embarrassing. We ended up at motels where I would have to sneak the dogs in at like midnight because there were no dogs allowed. So I've sacrificed a lot for dogs. To hear somebody who's never met me accuse me of torturing them, it's hard. It is not easy, and it does not make me want to listen anymore. I can promise you that. If the goal actually is to help educate and promote reinforcement-based methods, it's probably not a good idea to alienate the very audience that will make the most change in the dog training world, right? It's not the people who think like you where your big change is going to occur. It's people who are still using tools that actually you could see change. All right, so we went over that emotionally charged information. Let's go over method number 2, closely related but a little different, called social pressure. Social pressure, kind of similar, but this puts a lot of direct pressure on people, typically online, sometimes in person. Again, I'll go to the pro-life, pro-choice movement. This could be compared to people standing outside of a clinic and picketing women as they go in, trying to apply pressure to get these people to make a different choice. Oddly enough, one of the methods that the purely positive movement does not like in dogs, apparently it's okay in other species, I guess. It can be highly effective. One only has to look at history to see that. Back in the 90s, California had a huge littering problem. People just throwing their trash out the window. It would line the center divider on the freeway. And there was a big campaign, Clean Up California, and that helped stigmatize littering, which helped people make different choices. It also worked with smoking and tobacco. Stigmatizing smoking is no longer something that was sexy or appealing, but instead something that could give you cancer. Just like with the pro-choice, pro-life, wouldn't it be better to focus on methods that actually address the root of the problem? Methods like more access to birth control or women's education. Don't you think it's always better to address the core of why the woman is at the clinic for an abortion, or why somebody feels the need to use those tools? Number Number 3 on the method list are equipment bans. There are bans in other countries. People do have the misconception that just because there's an equipment ban means nobody's using compulsion. Nothing could be further from the truth. People are still using compulsion in those countries. They just don't use tools. The issue with bans is that they have unintended consequences, and there's case after case of this. Let's just start with the Obama era horse slaughter ban, when I think the last slaughter plant was closed down, and yay, horses, one of our greatest allies of mankind that helped us go so far, is no longer going to be slaughtered in the good old US of A. Instead, they were trucked to Mexico, where there are minimal regulations. Many of them also were neglected and starved because their owners didn't have enough money to care for them or their veterinary bills, and therefore that's why they were ending up at these slaughter plants. Bans have unintended consequences, and probably one of the biggest ones I can think of when it comes to an e-collar ban are the many dogs who right now, because of e-collars, because of the fencing e-collar business, have access to an acre, half an acre, 5 acres, and after that ban would be then potentially chained up. Fencing is expensive. It is so expensive to fence a large area. For most dog owners, they're not going to spend $50,000 to fence their acre yard. They're going to instead opt for either a smaller yard or more likely a chain. So dogs potentially are going to be going from large spaces to being chained up on 10 feet. A lot of dogs only get out because their owners have a prong collar and they are not used properly. The owner does no training and they just walk their dog on a prong collar. Hey, that dog's getting out. And if the only option you give people is either a head halter or a front harness, that is just not fair for the dog. This is when ideology gets in the way of kindness and common sense. I can think of no dog in the history of my career that would opt for a face halter over a prong collar with zero training. Now, I love head halters. I sell them on my website. I advocate for them, but they need to be properly conditioned. And I would argue even after they are properly conditioned, a very large part of dogs would still prefer, if you ask them, you can tell by their body language, they would prefer to have to be walked on a prong collar. Here's what a prong collar does. I'm putting my hand towards the heat. I feel the heat. It doesn't mean I'm being tortured. It doesn't mean I'm in pain, but I feel that heat and I don't continue to go forward. This gives people the possibility of getting these dogs outside and getting them exercise. So banning something that so many hundreds of Americans use to keep control of their dog not only affects that dog negatively, but it potentially puts the entire public at risk and the rest of the dogs walking around. If owners are trying to walk dogs they're not able to control. Front pull harness can be great, should not be used on a dog that's not trained because they can put all their effort in it, and squeezing shoulders like this, especially on a dog that hasn't finished developing, has real negative potential. So yeah, banning equipment is a little bit of a symptomatic approach. I think there's a way to do more good here that won't potentially have such a bad effect on dogs getting exercise and dogs having freedom. Okay, so we've gone over some of the methods that I think are a little more intrusive, a little more forceful, if you will. Let's go over some of the methods I think are superior to those and I think will do more good in the long run. Educating and teaching trainers where they can use reinforcement, especially in areas that maybe they haven't thought of before. This also involves demonstrating the effectiveness, which by far, when I polled all my balance trainers friends as what their biggest reason for not going in more into the R+ side was, the main thing was they didn't think they could get the same results. I'm one of those trainers. I have not found a way to get a nice formulaic, foolproof recall on almost any dog. That being said, who knows where the roof is? Maybe there's something I'm missing. Maybe there's something that we'll know in 10 years that will be kind of the missing link. When I was in my 20s, I did not think it was possible to train a dog to formally heel without corrections. Nowadays, that is all I do. All of my heel training is done without corrections. Many dogs never ever need a correction, and a lot of them, their first correction might just be in protection. So showing how it works and showing real life situations where dogs can be called off mid-chase from something is definitely essential to convert the final holdouts. Programs to teach balance trainers, or really really anyone, are going to be less utilized, again, if they are laced with villainization. Nobody wants to listen to how horrible they are while they're actually making the effort to try to change, which segues me to my next point, and that is the fallacy that the purely positive movement has regarding trainers changing. Let's start with an example here real quick. I use a very crappy video editing app that I know isn't the best method. Much better apps out there like Final Cut Pro. However, the system that I'm using is pretty simple. I've learned it already, and I know that if I take the time to learn Final Cut Pro, there's gonna be a lapse in my ability to be effective. In the same way, balance trainers are not going to be effective if they completely abandon the methods that they've learned for the last 15, 20, 30, whatever years and try to change 100% to something new. That's just not fair to expect. Think about it this way. If somebody comes to me, I know I can help them with my, old methods, but I've decided to stick to a new ideology, use R+ methods, and now that client, because I know that I'm not going to be as effective, they go to the guy down the street who's 5 times more brutal than they would have been if they'd trained with me while I was using balanced methods. So it can actually do more dogs harm when you have humane, let's say the good balanced trainers, abandoning the methods they know best just simply to hurry up and move and convert to this other ideology.